Wow, we're talking about the 100-Year War. What if a 100-year war went on for 100 years? That would be quite a long time. And wars are kind of crazy, especially this war, because it was kind of like a family feud. So, what do you think about wars, Hudson? Quite a deal. I agree. Wars are not too good, and if you have to live, especially if you have to live through them. Well, let's go back to the French and the English and the kings and the queens. See, it got pretty complicated back then because the French queens would come and marry the English kings, and they would have children that didn't know if they were French or English. And those children wanted to control the land, and they were ended up being cousins, royal cousins, in France and in England both. And they became very suspicious of each other in many ways. And they always wanted to know when the king died, who would inherit the throne. This is what happened in 1328. Charles IV died. And they had no heir. Well, King Edward III of England was the closest heir. You see, Charles was the king of France. So the king of England said, I'm his closest heir, so I will inherit both England and France. Well, the French no way, we are going to have an English king. They were very upset. And so became this family feud war between Edward and Philip of Valois, which was his cousin. So here, Philip, being his cousin, said, I will take the throne. And so they started fighting, and not until Edward saw that Philip really wanted to take over some of those provinces that he had already had. And so they started this siege of 100 years. Sieging castles. Sometimes castles would change between England and France up to 7 times. Can you believe that? The fighting was so numerous and widespread, and generations went by. Where children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren were still fighting those family feuds. There was the Battle of Crécy in 1346. Edward III defeated France because he had a newly invented weapon called the longbow. You see, they only had crossbows, but a longbow could go a long distance and kill from a long distance. And then they had another invention called the cannon. So Edward basically took over France at that time. And now they didn't need so many knights because they had these new weapons. But the war went on, and in the middle of the war became the plague called the Black Death that came, and that was basically a plague, bubonic plague that killed many people. So they put the war on hold for a little time, but then they started up again. And so Henry V, who was descendant, always remember Henrys and Edwards are usually English, and Charles and Phillips are usually French. You got to tell about those names in history. So Henry V and the war in Agincourt was called in 1413, and Henry was determined to end this war and to planned on taking France and taking the English land back. You see, Henry's great-great-grandmother was a French princess named Isabella. He said, that land you have belongs to me. I inherited, so give it to me. And your daughter, Catherine, needs to marry me so that we can have one kingdom. So the French king, which was Charles VI at that time, knew this couldn't happen. The French did not want to become English. And so he did not want Henry to marry his daughter, Catherine, at all. That just was not possible. And so Henry's claim was very sneaky way, and he was sneaking to be able to to do this whole thing, to sneak in, to capture, and to marry Charles' daughter. Well, Charles' son, who would be the Duke back then, the Duke or the Prince, I would say, the Dauphin Prince they called him, he sent Henry back a package of tennis balls and says, Henry, you're acting like a child. Why don't you just go play tennis? Henry, when he got it, was like pretty upset. He said, tell the prince that I'm glad he can make jokes with me, because when I hit these balls with my racket, I'm going to hit his father's crown right out of bounds. And I will turn these tennis balls into cannons. I tell you, this family really didn't get along. So Henry V and Charles VI went on battling. And as an Agincourt, Henry comes in, and Henry comes in, and his soldiers are growing sick, and their shoes are wearing out, and the winter's so cold that he turned off and he went back to England. But on the way back, the French cut him off, and they met at Agincourt, and Henry was outnumbered. The soldiers were tired, cold, and hungry and afraid, and Henry made a famous speech. And he said, we are a happy band of brothers, equals in battle. And he encouraged them so much that they felt that they were going to win the battle. In 1415, the Battle of Agincourt was the turning point, and the French King Charles VI gave his daughter to Henry V to marry when Henry won the battle. But right after the battle, you know what happened? Henry died, and then Charles died too. And so here we have Henry and Catherine, the princess queen of France, and Henry, the English king of England, having a baby. The baby was in diapers, only 1 year old. Can you imagine a king in diapers? The Dauphin Prince, remember the Prince Charles' son? He wanted to be king. Instead, he said, what is this little baby king? I should be the king of France. We do not need that England never got to take over France. And France was divided because some of the French, the Burgundians, wanted to be under England, and some of them wanted to be under France. And so we have some great wars still happening. And one of the greatest war during this time, 100 Years' War, was at the city of Orleans. But we'll talk about that. It has to do with a young lady named Joan of Arc.